all these things are difficult and technologically hard to imagine, but does grid management and transmission begin to balance the question of whether you really need 10 gigawatts of storage to deal with it?
Yes, at some level it absolutely does. We've done experiments internationally in that. Experiments meaning if you look at the Iberian Peninsula, this is Spain and Portugal, roughly average over a year, roughly 25% of their electricity is in intermittent wind and solar. They have a 1 gigawatt tie line to the rest of Europe. That's a small sliver. And so by transmitting over that, they can moderate that. Now, but you know, realistically, it gets harder and harder the higher the fraction you go. And either you have very long distance transmission and then you run into all the transmission issues, or you have other sources. Compact sources are still going to be very important this century. There's no debate about that. And these are, you know, are cleaner fossil fuel or nuclear power.
So coming back to Bill's point, are you basically in agreement in terms of that we need a source of baseload power that is carbon free?
I think this century, yes. You know, but after that, you know, following, was it Orville or Wilbur Wright or Yogi Berra, one of them? You know, it's hard to predict what's going to happen 100 years from today.
Yeah, storage is an interesting thing. There's a path that NREL supports, doesn't get a lot of effort, which is solar chemical,
right,
which is very interesting because it essentially has its storage solution built in. You're taking photons and making hydrocarbons. And so it's not impossible to think we might go down some path that you know, gets you out of the need for storage. If solar thermal is good, then you're storing heat as opposed to storing electricity, and there's a whole bunch of paths that might work out for that. The path dependence on this thing is very complex. You know, if offshore wind is cheap, the grid the United States wants looks very different than if onshore wind is much cheaper than offshore wind. Right. And so how do you prepare, how do you have a plan that can accommodate the various things that may happen with these economics? It's not easy to do. You know, it needs a lot of you know, scenario planning, things like the David Mackay book does, where it really asks the reader to go through and say, is there any source of energy you like that adds up to the amount of energy civilization will be using? And, you know, if so, are we doing the right things to make that come about?
Yeah, but also remember the two massive storages, water and compressed gas, are physical storage, right? Batteries are chemical storage. Heat storage is something which has not really gotten as much attention as need. We, both in ARPA and the rest of the Department of Energy, are looking at novel ways of storing heat, where it's chemically put on a shelf that you can trigger and you recover the heat without the insulation. But even heat with insulation, if it's large enough, becomes very effective. I'd cite two examples. It's becoming more prevalent that you have either an office building or office building complex. At night, if the electricity is cheap, you will chill water or you will freeze water to be used for cooling the next day. And this is increasingly being installed. If you have process heat, which can be either used for heating or chilling, just to have a big tank of either hot or cold water. I visited very recently a cogeneration plant. This is gas-fired, but it's only single-cycle gas, and then out comes very high-temperature heat. They use the heat as process heat. This is in Houston to cool the air conditioners. They use that process heat to cool a big tank of water so that they can now balance the generation of electricity with the heat, and that it takes 1/10 of the energy to keep that big tank of water in the hot Houston summer cool. And they use that to chill their buildings to run their air conditioning, and it's very cost effective. Now, if we can even push that further and drop the cost of heat storage, it could again have a profound impact on building cities, hospitals, you name it. So we're looking at that as well. again, going back to the old thing that a little bit of R&D, if you come up with some really good things, can actually find their way into the marketplace very quickly.
If we were talking 5 years ago, we'd be spending a lot more time on carbon capture and sequestration than we are today, I think, at this conference. Is the challenge of sequestration just too big in terms of both the technical challenge and the cost? And should we be thinking about utilization of CO2, either in building materials, liquid fuels? I'm on the board of a company that uses CO2 as a source for liquid fuels. Or are we going to stick with a strategy of thinking about what the regulatory and cost challenges are to a sequestration strategy?
Well, I think because of the risks that climate change brings to us, we do need a long-term price on carbon. The fact that while for a while looked like there might be a price on carbon over the long term, the fact that at least for the immediate future that went away, and a lot of the U.S. companies, in fact companies around the world who were going to invest billions of dollars in piloting or demoing carbon capture, have pulled back. However, there is still a lot of interest in many of these companies in saying, all right, we can still invest in the carbon capture. We can take that carbon dioxide and use it for enhanced oil recovery or other means. So there's still an appetite. In the end, you do need some price because I'd liken it to wastewater treatment. There has to be some incentive. If you're a town upstream, the cheapest way to deal with your wastewater is to dump it in the river. Cheap for you, very expensive downstream. And so there was something put in place that for the total cost is much cheaper in order to treat the water. And so if you talk about a fossil fuel plant, you know, it's always going to be, no matter how good the technology, it always costs more to capture the carbon and sequester. So you need a little incentive. Meanwhile, we are developing methods to drop that price dramatically.
I think it's one of the more underinvested areas on a global basis, including the policies of how governments would deal with the long-term issues.
Right.
But there have been a few aborted pilot projects in various places around the world. The scale of what's going on now is dramatically less.
Should the focus shift then to utilization as opposed to deep storage?
No, carbon dioxide doesn't have that many positive economic uses to justify taking 7 billion tons a year and capturing it. Capture is about preventing global warming.
Right.
There's not some neat little, okay, maybe I'll make my soft drinks a little fizzier and this problem will be solved. You know, all promise to drink more carbon dioxide. No. This is a
still
lot
somehow, even in a biological
stuff.
system, goes out there.
This is 1 million times more than all nuclear waste. This is big. And so it's just in a balanced portfolio of innovating. This one, because of some mistakes that were made, a lack of international competition, this one is particularly underfunded because there is promise there. It's a possible path for reduction of emissions.
But while I agree with that, I will say for the next half dozen years, you can do a lot of the capture technology, and the EOR is still a very small part of that. Mm-hmm. But you get more confidence injecting it underground, tracking what happens to the carbon dioxide. But in the end, yes, you will need a price on carbon. Absolutely. But, you know, for the next couple of years, this is how you can at least drive the technology development.